Ireland, a country stereotypically renowned for many things: friendliness, drinking, sports, the arts, Nobel Prize-winning poets and writers, and so on. It's also a country that's known generations of poverty and struggle, occupation and emigration. Fast forward to the modern day, particularly the late 1990s and early noughties, Ireland was on a road to major change. Life got better, more money, more jobs, more building, more immigration, the stuff of politicians' dreams. With all this has come a downside: more corruption, more cronyism, and the most ironic of all, more control from foreign powers in the form of the EU. In just a matter of years, Ireland has become a breeding ground of corruption. Throw a dart and you'll find scandal, corruption, and incompetence. The courts, the health system, housing, border control, immigration, tax haven banking, the list goes on. The hand-in-glove dealings between status quo political parties and players such as bankers, developers, the courts, the media, and non-government organizations have left a toxic mark on its society. Having just celebrated 100 years as a free state in 2022 was the last thing on people's mind in Ireland due to the events of the COVID lockdowns, including the government's. But given the increasingly hostile nature and treatment of their own people in recent years, it's wondered if they cared at all. Ireland has become essentially a vassal state of the EU, with the full support of all the established parties of the country. They have willingly and enthusiastically handed over the country lock, stock and barrel to EU control and regulation. The events of the global financial crisis between 2007 and 2009 marked the moment the financial, economic and legislative sovereignty of the country were surrendered completely, since EU membership. Since then, the established parties have fallen in line with the commands of Brussels. Every aspect of farming and fishing are under EU control, with Irish fishermen being told where they can fish in Irish waters, while other fishing fleets of EU countries are allowed to take larger and larger quotas, with a loss of billions since becoming an EU member. Irish farmers are under the thumb of ludicrous Green Deal policies, being paid subsidies to farm less and less for the sake of rewilding and climate change policies, while Ireland has some of the most fertile soil in the world, all the while being tracked, monitored and scrutinized by an EU satellite grid, to be kept under constant control. Green policies continue to threaten indigenous industries, such as the peat industry used to power some of our electricity stations, while still being imported from Eastern Europe. Wind turbines, which are ludicrously carbon footprint intensive, are seen as a clean alternative, when truly nothing more than short-term investment schemes that spoil the vista of the beautiful Irish landscape and coastlines, while risking damage to native wildlife, are being pushed politically. Other areas of Irish society that continue to be in crisis are housing and health. The collapse of the housing and property market between 2008 and 2009 destroyed the nation's economy. Despite the criminally fatal decision of bootstrapping the private debts of this sector, the banks and developers, to public debt, putting extraordinary burden on the ordinary taxpayer for generations to come, as a decision that was supposed to save the country from economic depression, still resulted in recession due to being tied to the EU's financial system and the domino effect felt on all member states, as well as across the Western world. So, how did Ireland come to be where it is today? Let's find out. None of the political parties existing in Ireland today would come close to describing themselves as nationalist, never mind ethno-nationalist, despite Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two largest political parties in the country, describing themselves to be centre-right. being born from the ashes of the fight for the recognition of the Republic of Ireland to be its own free and independent state. Even once Republic parties have long abandoned their roots. Fianna Fáil lately describe itself as a catch-all party, playing the public mood of the moment, while Fine Gael since the 1970s have become increasingly left-leaning in outlook and policies, pushing first for divorce, the legalizing of contraceptives then gay marriage throughout the past 30 years, before pushing even further again for abortion and transgender rights in the past 10 years. All parties, in fact, could well be described as left-leaning, from Fianna Fáil to Labour, the Social Democrats and People Before Profit. All are completely on board with an extreme leftist ideology-ruled Ireland, of socialism, woke and diversity liberalism, and no-cap open borders to immigration. The left have been left so long in Ireland that any hint of nationalism or state protectionism, be it economically, culturally or religiously, to rear its head, is quickly attacked and ridiculed as racist, old-fashioned or discriminatory by this uni-party of leftist ideologues and fanatics. Despite appearing to be left-leaning and liberal when it comes to social matters such as gay rights and abortion, both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have taken some of the worst attitudes and approaches to their minimal government interference and pro-enterprise policies. Some disastrous examples include having allowed Vulture and other multinational hedge funds to come into the country and play havoc on the property market, essentially disrupting and destroying the social housing base for a growing population in an ongoing housing shortage crisis. Data harvesting and management companies have been allowed to come and build huge energy-consuming plants close to residential areas, in a country with some of the highest residential utility costs in Europe, who also receive taxpayer-funded subsidy grants. The excuse for their being here is said they provide vital jobs and infrastructure. Another long-running scheme of the government's is the competitively low corporate tax rate, the is up their sleeve. It has effectively made Ireland one of the most lucrative tax havens in the world, something that will be examined a bit later in much greater detail. Of late, the taxpayer-funded and manufactured asylum and refugee crisis, of which millions have been paid to hotels and other property owners to house alleged asylum seekers since 2021, while contractors who provide housing and other services have also profiteered, is arguably the worst to date. The Irish public were originally told Ukrainian war refugees of women and children would be coming, and although numbers did, fast forward to 2024, Ireland has been flooded with hundreds of thousands of African and Middle Eastern economic migrants across its towns and cities, disrupting its communities and endangering its people. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, along with their government partners the Green Party, as of 2024 have created a two-tier society of Ireland, where this economic migrant population receive better treatment and care than many Irish homeless, sick and elderly, in a country with an already worsening housing, health and public resources crisis. Even legal levels of immigration are raising questions across Ireland, with many agreeing far too many immigrants have been allowed in. The strain on housing, jobs, and quality of living are already beginning to validate this argument, as well as the cultural and demographic impact being had in the native Irish population themselves. Here, one Irish woman gives her story of the rapidly changing demographic landscape of Dublin.
I'm from Dublin, but I come to Mayo every weekend. But I wanted to talk about what the situation is like where I live, because you have not seen what is coming yet, and I have. Where I live is about 85% foreign nationals. I can walk down the street on any given day, walk into the supermarket, and I don't hear an Irish conversation. I hear foreign people everywhere. My child is one of 30 children in her class, and she's the only Irish child. She came home crying from school a few weeks ago because she doesn't understand what any of her friends are saying. The children revert back to their own languages when they're not being taught. She literally cannot understand the conversations around her. But when Halloween came around there a few months ago, last year she was allowed to dress up, the year before last she was allowed to dress up, this year she wasn't allowed to dress up. And when I asked the school why, they said they didn't want to offend people. But I don't go for a walk around the park during the day with my child anymore. I have a big dog and I don't go for a walk by myself anymore. I very rarely leave my house because where I live is so unsafe. And that is the reality that you're facing if you don't make a stand. And I understand it's really, really hard to, be called names and all of these things. But you have to stand up on behalf of your children and the future of the country. The landscape of this country is changing completely. And if you're okay with that, fine, but I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with that for my child. Please put your children first and your country first, and just don't care what anyone else thinks.
The nature of Irish politics and its parties follow quite predictable routes. Committed loyalty to the party, leader and candidates are central to the party identity, with some even born into ardently loyal families with generations of party members and activists. Traditionally, the strong clannish nature of Irish politics and its parties often prevail over any sense of state, acting like family feuds, negotiating access to state structures. Of the older generations of political class in Ireland, careers were often distinguished by obscure social origins and questionable qualifications, many most typically coming from educational backgrounds such as being teachers. Newer generations, although more educated in line with ambitions and appointed positions, are more ideologically driven. A local over national identity and care of image in politics is in large part to blame for the Irish public to keep rewarding self-serving politicians and bad behaviour. Parish pump politics is alive and well in Ireland, unfortunately. Irish political history shows that the public want accountability, but not deal with the consequences or responsibility. They simply keep to their loyalties and hope individual candidates will set things right in their minds and not blame the overall party or party culture. As long as breadcrumb favours and results keep being doled out to them and their local community, all the while the mainstream media keep them in the dark or offer a one-sided narrative of events the very parties they support are affecting for better, or indeed worse. This needs to stop.
An oncology department where my mother-in-law was dying, where there were people on chairs with grieving people, there were people who were trying to fight for life and cling on to hope beside people who are dead. And this moron's name was on a plaque saying it was open, the oncology suite by Micheál Martin, when he screwed the place from the time he went in to the time he left. What the bloody hell is going on?
Traditionally, with individual politicians, they would be welcomed in their local constituencies. The small-minded clannishness and local fame and reputation blinds local supporters to absolve them of sins, because they have been good to them in the past, such as, well, they fixed the road. This also needs to stop. Past Irish governments, and to an extent those of recent, run the country by four means: an all-embracing regulation of economic activity, an extensive state role in ownership of industries, development of a welfare state, providing selective and generous benefits to gain favour and voter loyalty, and lastly a large public administration to absorb excess labour as a provision of public service. All four of these are continually used by parties in power for their own partisan interests. A large public sector and large welfare state offer the means to mobilize votes and support for material benefits and state-funded salaries for key party workers. For example, from 1995 till 2009 of 649.2 billion in public expenditure, 178.9 billion went to public sector salaries and pensions. This over-regulation of economic life has allowed what is described as rent-seeking opportunities for parties to grant favors to business interests through deregulation and privatization. This has historically and evidently led to corruption and cronyism. Between matters of public and private sector, the state is widely seen as a resource to be exploited by political and business interests, of which there is a legacy proven to be the case, and not cultivated for the betterment and prosperity of the most vulnerable in Irish society, most notably the elderly, sick, and homeless. The 1960s in Ireland was defined by a struggle between old and newly emerging political and economic elites. However, from about that time onward, inevitably the establishment started to embrace the outside world characterized, although not entirely exemplary in time to come, by ambitious self-made men in the form of Dermot Desmond, Patrick Gallagher, Larry Goodman, and most notoriously of all, Charles Hoy. In the 80s and 90s, these new economic actors of property developers, entrepreneurs, financial men, and agricultural barons wanted access to traditionally closed markets the government had access to, and began challenging this, eventually with areas such as aviation and telecommunications being open to private sector competition. This, as well as proliferation of EU funds through both complicated and poorly monitored channels, coincided with a spate of corruption inquiries in the form of the Hamilton, Flood, and Main tribunals. Entrepreneurial actors took advantage of archaic, bureaucratic, and political systems. The formal political system was unable to cope with the scale of rapid changes happening to the country. The Golden Circles basically exploited uncertainties associated with market transitions that held an inadequate ethical framework to hold to account the privatization process. The privatization process in Ireland in awarding public resources through license have in fact always lacked transparency. The long-happening culture of discretionary decision-making through the use of Irish political culture, the party system, and the media to gatekeep information has led to systemic exploitation of the Irish taxpayer since the 1970s, most notably the Golden Circle era of the 1980s and 1990s, and the tribunal period of the late 1990s into the noughties. Once again in 2024, Ireland finds itself in the grips of political and economic elites, vying for their own gains and control of the country in the form of the manufactured immigration crisis, with yet again the ordinary Irish citizen and taxpayer the collateral damage and victim. This must stop. Despite the positive and progressive socio-economic changes having taken place for Ireland since the 1990s, its political paradigm remains the same, with parties still relying on parish pump politics when it comes to local elections, ardent followers despite their failings, using the powers allotted to them and state resources to play favourites, with councillors and ministers doling out grants and funding to often personally favoured causes, both private and public, locally and nationally. And although not illegal, the accountability framework in government is often characterized by an absence of clearly defined rules, regulations, policies, and legislating governing interest in regards to the setting up and staffing of state bodies, with boards being routinely politically appointed through favoritism, due to many regulatory agencies being removed from direct public accountability, leading to cronyism and patronage. Such bodies and agencies include the Arts Council, Irish Prison Services, Court Services, National Road Authority, and the Office of Public Works. All have no oversight for members of government to be subject to parliamentary questions, essentially being left to be a law unto themselves, historically resulting in risk of cronyism and corruption. Political party finances, campaigns and lobbying falling into this grey area also. In the case of lobbying, however, there are thankfully watch bodies to monitor this. Another important aspect of government is the 1997 Freedom of Information Act, intended to make it more transparent to the public, has deliberately been weakened by expensive fees for access to information, plus a charge for appeals, leading to a fall in requests from the public and the media. This, as well as changes and interferences in rules of access over certain topics, such as politician salaries and public money expenditure disclosure, place the legislation severely in doubt as a core to Ireland's democracy. One abuse of power, though not illegal but certainly immoral, by the political parties and business-related players over the years, has been the use of tribunals to whitewash their crimes and failings. Reversion to tribunals of inquiry has allowed them to relegate potentially damaging effects of official corruption to mechanisms that provide a degree of cover for themselves, and effectively get off the hook, at often enormous waste of taxpayers' money, for long drawn-out inquiries. Ireland's politicians are among the highest paid in the world, and like other politicians in similar Western countries, own businesses, assets, land and property outside of their political vocations. Being a public servant in Ireland certainly has its perks, as the political class have made sure for themselves. So much so, they have tried to hide the fact from the public. A story from the Irish Independent in 2018 gave a rare glimpse into this, lifting the lid on politician salaries, perks and privileges, showcasing the net worth of some of Ireland's most prolific political names. And given this was 2018, the political class in power have since given themselves even more of a pay rise. Here are some of the existing perks and privileges given to TDs in holding office. The combined wealth of each of the political parties were also given in this story, clocking up to be quite substantial. What's more, TDs are given the privilege to be trusted to disclose all investments and earnings, indeed another rule of privilege written for this self-serving political class. Only the process of democracy, the will of the public, can end this gravy train for the political cabal having grip of the country for so long. Thankfully, for the first time in a generation, true grassroots opposition are on the rise, of whom will be looked at in greater detail a bit later. With the establishment of the Free State in 1922, and for Ireland finally to feel self-autonomy from British rule, in forging ahead to shape the nation as its leaders saw fit, involved bringing it into the 20th century. No one project personified this new hopeful horizon in looking to the future, coming from the troubled and recent past of the 1916 Rising and Civil War that followed, than the ambitious electrification of the country. The Shannon Scheme, a massive hydroelectric project at Ardnacrusha in southeast County Clare, remains the most ambitious engineering project undertaken in the history of the Irish state. Its scale and importance made it an economic centerpiece of the state-building program during the 1920s, and one of the few major success stories of the decade in the early days of the new Free State. In 1923, a young engineer from Drogheda, Thomas McLaughlin, returned to Ireland after a period working abroad with Siemens in Berlin and studying hydroelectric schemes in Europe. In 1925, together with Siemens and the help of TD Patrick McGilligan, McLaughlin succeeded in getting a white paper on the scheme accepted by the newly formed Free State government. A budget of £5.1 million was allocated to the ambitious project, 20% of Ireland's national revenue for that time. The Electricity Supply Bill was passed in 1925, and work began on the Shannon Scheme in August of that year. During construction, 4,000 Irish and 1,000 German men worked and lived on site at Ardnacrusha, County Clare. The station was officially opened in July 1929 and began to generate power on the national network in October that year. The Shannon Scheme led to the establishment of IFSC in 1927 and was the first national electricity system in the world to integrate all the components of the electricity supply chain, that is, the generation, distribution, marketing, transmission, and sale of electricity. The newly formed Free State government set about developing a plan of liberal economics. Between 1932 and 1958, there was an intense focus and effort to build up domestic industrialization of the country. Although eventually, with the outside world growing exponentially post-Second World War, and the competition of other much larger countries to grapple with, such as France and Germany, Ireland found it had its limits to domestic growth. Its exports could only manage so far without cutting prices, while still managing to make a profit. From 1958 onward, the establishment and business classes had to face the reality of needing to adopt a global outward view on economy to compensate for domestic shortcomings and failures, in order to continue growth and prosperity of the nation. Ireland needed a plan to attract foreign investment. The noble efforts of those who managed the establishment in the first 30 years of its life, to give new optimism and hope to a troubled nation, unfortunately had its limits. Ever since then, the state has used its sovereignty to attract foreign capital, most predominantly tax-based incentives, while trying to manage and maintain relationships and incentives for domestic banking, agriculture, and construction. One man to come from Irish Civil War roots, having been a soldier in the conflict to win his country's sovereignty, who stands historically as the father and visionary of the new state industries of Ireland, was Sean Lemass. Lemass became the visionary for the development of the semi-state model, to manage essential enterprises in a modern functioning state. Believing in a long-term approach to semi-state bodies and projects, he saw was the advantage over private business, as being taxpayer-funded allowed for much longer timelines and thus allowed to become more long-term investments for the good of the nation. In a paper he presented to the Institute of Public Administration in 1959, Lemass outlined taking a long-term approach in a number of key establishments such as the SBE, Air Rionta, Irish Shipping, the CIE, Aer Lingus, Ord na Móna, the Irish Sugar Company, and the Industrial Credit Company. Lemass stressed the semi-state model was pragmatical, not socialistic. In his paper of 1959, he gave warning, however. There is a danger in the course of time these organizations may be directed and administrated with decreasing regard for the national needs and increasing and undue concern for the benefits and convenience of its staff. Saying also, the state-sponsored boards, if they are to fulfill their proper role in the national economy, require to be kept under continuous pressure to revise their procedures and costs in a continuous effort to maintain their efficiency. With the departure of Lemass from government in 1966, his words and deeds would, in time, be betrayed. The generations to follow, not of those who knew struggle and hardship in the founding of a free state, would foolishly and selfishly betray his legacy. Lemass's very own son-in-law, Charles Haughey, would be among the newer generation of politicians to turn their backs on their ancestors, heritage and history, and not treat the free state, as well as the suffering, sacrifice and hard work it took to create it, and they came to inherit and enjoy, with the respect it deserved. Again, with Lemass's departure in 1966, his successor Jack Lynch chose to allow the wishes of a government guided by morals and integrity for the good of the nation by Lemass to go unheeded. Haughey rose to power quickly within the ranks of Fianna Fáil, and had plans to rub shoulders with Ireland's business circles and communities, and so began the Fianna Fáil legacy of hand-in-glove relationships with property developers and other business tycoons, through the founding of TACA in 1966 to create their culture of cronyism and favouritism. Lynch chose party self-preservation over the good of the nation. A longtime friend of Lemass and Fianna Fáil member Todd Andrews, from their IRA days of the Civil War, saw the direction Haughey was taking the party in. Disgusted at Lynch's decision to endorse TACA, cut ties with the party, the last of the old guard sadly were fading away to newer generations of politicians where the good of their nation wasn't a first priority, to the detriment of Ireland and its people. Worse was indeed yet to come. As previously mentioned, Ireland in the early decades of the new Free State between the 1920s and 1950s saw ambitious growth industrially and economically, but domestic economy had its limits and peaked by the end of the 1950s. There were a number of reasons as to why this was the case. Despite the conflict between the British Empire of the time and the Irish Rebellion, after the Free State was formed, Ireland still remained a vital trading partner for the UK. As Ireland was still a largely agricultural society, it supplied the now more industrialised and urbanised UK with food and other resources for its empire, a relationship by then centuries old. British industrialists and Anglo-Irish landowners became staunch allies alongside the financier class for the sake of trade. In the 1920s, then Minister for Agriculture Patrick Hogan maintained Ireland to be a predominantly agricultural power. Along with the tools of free trade flow, low taxes and government spending or intervention, saw it as a strong model for national prosperity, while also supporting the principal economic backers, being the financial investors and major farmers. The government also adopted the British system of corporate profit tax, as well as income tax on profits. One policy, however, that was to prove detrimental was the handing of state monetary management over to private bankers in 1927, having consequences, as it tied the punt to the pound at parity, making Irish manufactured goods uncompetitive, and thus inhibiting indigenous growth for the nation. Despite this detrimental effect on industry and agriculture, was seen as a necessary evil and sacrifice of a wider economic strategy. As a result, ordinary working Irish gained nothing economically from the first decade of independence. Many smaller property owners, farmers and businesses were essentially neglected and alienated. With the events of the Wall Street crash in 1929 and major economic downturns to follow, Fianna Fáil, for the first time in its history, rose in popularity in offering the hope of shifting direction for the nation, gaining the support of the ordinary Irish, small farmers, and local businessmen, by promising a new protectionist strategy and a break from British influence. In 1932, they would be elected to power for the first time in their history. Beginning with imposing a series of tariffs and quotas on imported goods to help stimulate the indigenous industrial base. By 1936, Fianna Fáil made tariffs and quotas on thousands of imported goods. However, as the 1930s wore on and the economic model of Fianna Fáil set in motion started to have successful results for domestic industry, its ministers argued Ireland, being a predominantly agricultural economy, was keeping it enslaved to its largest trading partner of Britain and others. The country needed more industrialization. The Control of Manufacturing Act 1932 stimulated new industrial growth and new production factories and facilities, bringing about success and prosperity for business owners and workers alike, with 2/3 of all share capital being owned by Irish citizens. Shielded from the rigors of international competition, the policy was working, growing industrial production by 50% between 1931 and 1938, with industrial employment rising to 57,000 in that period, in such areas as clothing, footwear, and engineering. Sadly, however, limitations were to arise. Again, as earlier mentioned, Ireland, being a small domestic market, had limits to its expansion. A limited market at home meant a limited chance of being big enough competition to others, as well having technological limitations at the time. Fiscal policies also proved inhibiting and constraining. The private banking powers of the country of the time were reluctant to cut all links to the British pound. Despite Fianna Fáil's strong attacks and criticisms on them for bleeding farmers dry and crushing local industry, while investing Irish money abroad, they remained powerless to stop them. The NFL never managed to wrestle full control of the economy from the bankers until 1943, with the establishment of a central bank. Even by that time and well into the 1950s, the economy continued to lag and stagnate due to the detrimental effects of the fiscal policy of the banking system. The protectionist model envisioned by now was stagnating GDP. Ireland needed to start looking outward. Come the 1950s, it was clear protectionism had its limits to economic growth and prosperity for the country. It was agreed upon that state sovereignty could be better leveraged and directed towards foreign investment. The government took action on this right away, with the establishment in 1951 of the Export Board, followed by the Industrial Development Authority in 1952. This was followed by the introduction of an Exports Profits Relief Tax in 1956, offering foreign companies tax exemptions on profits for up to 10 years. The government went further with the scrapping of the Control of Manufacturers Act, replacing it with a series of tax reliefs to buy plant and machinery. Sean Lemass, the father of modern industrial Ireland, was central to these policy changes, and in 1959 begins to envision stimulating the Irish economy through a number of means, as well as his development in semi-state model companies, plans to attract foreign direct investment and business tycoons, through the innovation of creating the world's first free trade zone at Shannon Airport. The first Industrial Development Authority Centre is built to facilitate this free trade zone, and thus began the touting of Ireland to international business prospects, with promises of no tax and double after-tax profits to mainly US investors and industrialists, with capital allowance and goods tax incentives also being introduced. Be it out of necessity, be it desperation as the consequences of being a small nation in a competitive world, with limited domestic growth. This was to be the first time in its history the Irish government were willing to use its state taxation policy to attract foreign investment, and as time went on, was a proven triumph. By the 1980s, there were almost 1,000 foreign enterprises present in Ireland. In time, direct foreign investment in Irish industry was cemented as a cornerstone of government policy, causing a transformation in dynamics between domestic, foreign and state capital that was to change the country forever. The idealistic vision of Lemass's modern Ireland, thriving with foreign investors and industrialists who would integrate to the Irish culture, mindset and work ethic, didn't end up going as planned. Initial hopes were it would create linkages with Irish industrial and manufacturing companies, but things didn't quite turn out that way. Those who set up business in the country later proved to be disinterested in creating such ties, outside of hiring workforce, with the creation of jobs. A dualistic industrial culture soon formed as a consequence, with a more technically advanced foreign sector leaving behind its domestic Irish counterparts as the 1960s, 70s and 80s wore on. Changes were happening in other areas of Irish society as well. The financial sector saw profitable changes due to foreign capital entering the country. Accountant and consultancy firms saw a rise in business due to their services being required for the boom in office and administration building occurring with the passing of the Office Premises Act of 1958 as part of plans to stimulate the economy. The property and construction sector was obviously a big part of this shift, opening up profitable avenues and opportunities for building firms and developers. and although created a jobs boom in building and construction, stimulating industrial trades programs and apprenticeships, was setting the groundwork for a culture that held the risk of becoming toxic in decades to come. Since the economic stimulation of the 1960s and the boom in building that followed, the political parties of the country, namely Fianna Fáil, under their direction in government, have shown a complete devotion to outside influence, attracting and serving the needs of global corporations and other forms of foreign direct investment, in turn creating and cultivating groups of patronage networks to protect the interests of both Irish and foreign elites in many sectors of industry, none more so than the land developer and building sectors. A well-documented and historical culture of corruption and cronyism has grown up around the relationship between political power and the construction sector. This has been for a number of reasons, apart from those involved doing so for profit and greed. Favourable zoning and rezoning decisions are crucial for profitability, making it essential for developers to stay on good terms with civil servant decision-making and governance, being in the know inside government buildings, giving them crucial advantages in securing successful zoning decisions, and the chance for contracts secured through the State and Industrial Development Authority. Further tax incentives, and the knowingness that state-sponsored infrastructure projects are done with the blank check of public money, with the benefits flowing to private property holders, fosters a culture of cronyism and corruption, as has evidently been the case in Ireland. From 1965, Fianna Fáil under Jack Lynch and Charles Haughey began to turn their backs on the working and middle classes, to cultivating the wealthy business owner, investor and financier classes of the country, indirectly labelling themselves as the Builders' Party, establishing the semi-clandestine fundraising group TACA with party loyalists and members. The Fianna Fáil, once known between the 1930s and 1950s Ireland, regarded as their protectionist era, under the watchful eye of its founders and best minds, put their nation and people first, with ambitious housing programs for working-class families across Dublin and the rest of the country, was a social housing miracle yet to be seen again. The complete change in attitude of the party, with the changing of the guard in Lynch and Haughey and their cultivation of Ireland's business circles, was a betrayal to the ordinary population. Instead turned to see housing as a commodity and not an attainable right. This privatization philosophy within the party, and as a consequence government, as Fianna Fáil have been among the few parties to hold power continuously, has led to a history of corruption, cronyism and conflict for the nation since the 1960s, much of which will be looked at shortly, most notably the Celtic Tiger era. Housing, as many know, is a continuously contentious issue for Ireland and its people, no thanks to Fianna Fáil and its legacy.
Good evening. I wish to talk to you this evening about the state of the nation's affairs, and the picture I have to paint is not, unfortunately, a very cheerful one. The figures which are just now becoming available to us show one thing very clearly. As a community, we are living way beyond our means. I don't mean that everyone in the community is living too well. Clearly many are not, and have barely enough to get by. But taking us all together, we have been living at a rate which is simply not justified by the amount of goods and services we are producing. To make up the difference, we have been borrowing enormous amounts of money, borrowing at a rate which just cannot continue. A few simple figures will make this very clear. At home, the government's current income from taxes and all other sources in 1979 fell short of what was needed to pay the running costs of the state by about £520 million. To meet this and our capital programme, we had to borrow in 1979 over £1,000 million. That amount is
Corruption was endemic in Ireland throughout the 1960s and 70s. With the new business and development landscape and culture that had opened up, a network of executives, developers, and politicians were using the state to further their own interests. This came to a head with the exposure of one of Ireland's most notoriously corrupt figures, Charles Haughey, who, by now riding his wave of power and dominance within Fianna Fáil and government, had become connected, powerful, and wealthy. While the ordinary Irish struggled and strived during these times, Haughey famously told the nation they had to tighten their belts, while he and his ilk were wearing the finest of suits and dining in the finest of restaurants. Haughey was finally exposed with the Ans-Backer tax scam. In 1969, one of Haughey's personal accountants, Des Traynor, began to mastermind an elaborate tax scam, benefiting in all 179 of Ireland's elite with a bank in the Cayman Islands. He began in 1971 to set up the Guinness Mahon Cayman Trust. This allowed him to take money from his clients to avoid tax, when really resting in accounts he managed from his office on Stephen's Green, made to look like they were offshore, but really not. This kept their money at hand they could write off interest for, while supposedly paying abroad as an extra deduction against their taxes. Despite covering his tracks to protect client identities, by developing a system of memorandum accounts to track who owned what assets, alongside a system of anonymity codes. In 1976, the Irish Central Bank accountants, on a routine inspection, discovered loans backed by offshore accounts and concluded it to be a tax deduction scam. But amazingly, instead of ordering Traynor close them down, accepted his word he would cease operations, and decided to label the case as avoidance and not evasion. Corruption on the matter wasn't too far away. Director of the central bank at the time, Ken O'Reilly, a major funder of Fianna Fáil, was also one of the account holders. Fearing exposure, blocked the central bank from taking any action in having the accounts shut down, or information being passed on to the tax office. The scam continued for 25 years, only again coming to light in 1997, when payments from the late Irish business giant Ben Dunne to Charles Haughey and former Fine Gael minister Michael Lowry led investigations to be made, of which nearly 200 accounts were discovered, many of which were the inner circles who bankrolled Fianna Fáil.
Former Taoiseach Charles Haughey is to testify before the Dunn's Payments to Politicians Tribunal, his legal team said today. Counsel for Mr Haughey accepted as a matter of probability that £1.3 million was paid into accounts controlled by accountant Des Traynor for Mr Haughey, but said Mr Haughey did not know that this money came from Ben Dunne. Earlier, counsel for the tribunal outlined evidence which is to be presented, which they believe proves that Mr Haughey obtained the use and benefit of the money at the centre of the investigation.
For the first time in modern Irish history, this exposed more than showing the general public that their country was a two-tiered society. It showed what a disgrace its leaders in business and politics were to be, capable of being the lowest of the low. Haughey, in the space of his career, overall took £45 million in bribes and other corrupt payments from business associates and friends, in return for favours and access to government resources. He lived in a mansion in Kinseely, Dublin, owned a yacht, stud farm and even his own private island, while ordinary Irish people drudged under his government policies. Despite his legacy of corruption and cronyism, the toxic culture he nurtured and cultivated between he and his ilk, as Ireland to be a commodity used as they saw fit at the detriment to its people, was to be his lasting legacy. Fianna Fáil have long abandoned the care and passion for Ireland its founders had in those first decades of the Free State. Since his passing, generations of the party have kept the Hawkey philosophy and memory alive, cultivating inner circles, as well as foreign political, financial and economic powers. A final mark Hawkey was to make on the country, arguably worst of all, was helping establish the Irish Financial Services Centre in Dublin, commonly known as the IFSC, in 1987. This institution in time would spawn a legacy of corruption and cronyism so vast, if Hawkey was alive today, would perhaps make him blush with shame or pride, as it has since become the tax haven nerve centre of Ireland, and one of the most lucrative tax havens in the world. On its website, the IFSC describes itself to be globally recognized as a leading location for a range of internationally traded services in finance, further adding the importance of the International Financial Services Centre to the Irish economy as being indisputable. It has become one of the leading hedge fund service centres in Europe, with many of the world's most important financial institutions have a presence there. Nowhere on its website, however, will it blatantly say it is the nerve centre of one of the major tax havens in the world, one that the political establishment of the country are wholly complicit in, namely that of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. The closest it comes to admitting this, however, is where again on its website is stated, one of the most important factors in the success of the IFSC to date has been the commitment by successive governments since 1987 to its development as an international financial centre. Further stating, this can be clearly seen in the way in which regulatory and taxation legislation has been amended over the last few years to enhance the IFSC's attractiveness to foreign investors. The legislation in question is key to Tax Haven Ireland's operations and will be looked at in much greater detail. But first, a look at the origins of the IFSC is much needed. Dermot Desmond, an associate of Hawkey within Ireland's political and financial circles, recalls a dinner meeting held in the mid-1980s, in which Hawkey and his government were looking for ideas to generate more taxes. Desmond's background was in international financial services, and made proposals on how to make Ireland a viable location for an international financial centre. Desmond drew up a paper outlining plans, but the coalition government of the time shelved it. Later in 1986, he proposed the idea again to Hawkey, who then invited Desmond to sit in on an economic advisory committee, followed by several further discussions on the matter. Then, prior to the general election in 1987, Hawkey wished to make it part of his election campaign manifesto, with many still rejecting the idea. To overcome resistance and transform the idea into reality, Hawkey agreed to set up the IFSC committee, involving all the relevant government departments and private sector interests. The Dublin Docklands location was chosen as the site for the new centre. Already owned by the state, would have no worry of outside manipulation or delay in construction. The financial community of Dublin did not warm to the idea of the IFSC right away. The Department of Finance were opposed to the plan because they were worried the scheme would undermine bank tax revenues, while the major banks of the country all had their own locations in mind to operate from. Hawkey was not dissuaded or perturbed. He was determined to have the IFSC established, as it was crucial to his political manifesto, while being part of a planned finance bill to come. Telling the banking community it was to be built and not allow self-interest, meaning the banks, to take over. Desmond has sung Hawkey's praises in retrospect, saying the IFSC has, since those days of its founding, paid for itself in taxes generated for the state, without any loss or payment from the taxpayer, but has criticised complacency of its purpose and the need for the Irish financial sector to remain competitive. By competitive, could Desmond surely be alluding to the case of tax evasion? Indeed, the financial sector deals in the areas of hedge funds, reinsurance, securitization, and exchange-traded funds. But there is no denying tax evasion is part and parcel of the financial world, of which the Irish state is a part of which the following will evidently reveal. The limits and shortcomings of the protectionist era. Under the Fianna Fáil government of the 1930s to the 1950s would unfortunately be seen again with Lamasse's visions and expectations for a post-50s modern Ireland, thriving on foreign direct investment from American and other companies, providing jobs and economic prosperity. Though the country had some degrees of success in the decades that followed, with the production of goods and services, the economy, it seemed, just couldn't boom on exports or domestic spending and consumption alone. The nature of capitalism and international finance was ever-changing throughout the 20th century, and what appeared to be the problem? Outside forces that Ireland was grappling to keep up with, and that of its leaders, as were many countries. A genuine spike in real investment did begin to occur, however. In the early 1990s, the Eurozone was indeed a factor. However, the inflow of money was taking advantage of existing government policy, such as transfer pricing rules, treasury management operations, and other forms of tax incentive, essentially where foreign firms were moving goods through their Irish operations to take advantage of low tax rate. This, as a consequence, created the illusion of growth and development. By the end of the 90s, real growth was overtaken and squeezed out by the economics of the Celtic Tiger bubble. The Celtic Tiger essentially had two phases between 1993 and 2000. It was a genuine and healthy export-led boom, but beyond 2000 until the crash in 2008 was artificially inflated, as well known, driven by banking and construction. A fatal flaw dyed in the wool of the Irish economy, ever since the 1950s, has been the over-reliance and development in the areas of construction and finance, and although others make up the economy, such as foreign pharmaceutical and electronics companies, have become the ones most relied upon to prop up the economy. Although domestic industries in such areas as food production have existed for decades in Ireland, the neoliberal model of the establishment seems to blatantly bypass the need for a domestic industry policy, and have relied upon foreign companies to provide variety in industry and employment, such as technology, heavy engineering, and manufacturing. Even while Ireland has always had strong ties to food and agricultural production, it has gradually seen the erosion of these areas under EU rules and regulations. Some historic and notable examples being the eradication of the Irish sugar industry in recent years, EU farming subsidies to perturb and stop farmers from producing to full capacity, with what they do produce largely going to export. Perhaps the worst of all has been the exploitation of Ireland's fishing waters, again by the EU. Returning to the issue of the historical over-reliance by the Irish establishment on the domestic banking and construction sectors, having led to disastrous consequences socio-economically, most notably during the Celtic Tiger era, but still remaining an issue to this day, in 2024, sees Ireland in a perpetual housing crisis, due to current policies by government reducing social housing to a minimum, while allowing private vulture funds to buy up vast amounts of housing stock, who then sell back to the government or through the housing market. Much of this is due to the aftermath of the collapse in 2008 and the establishment of NOMA, to be looked at shortly. Ireland, much like the rest of the world, is influenced by the factors of cheap labour and strong open global economies in order to remain viable economically, even more so being a small country. During the Celtic Tiger era, the country saw a massive influx of foreign labour to fuel the housing boom, as well as cheap money borrowed from international banks, that was then borrowed from domestic banks by developers and house buyers, with the bubble eventually bursting as wages and house prices reached a peak. This resulted in a shrinking of the labour pool in the construction sector, alongside the collapse in the housing market and failing of the banking sector. Similar factors of expansion and contraction remain a reality, although perhaps to play out in different circumstances now and for the future. Wages cannot keep rising without being affected by inflation, and whatever areas of activity that affect society will eventually reach a peak and contract gradually, or come crashing down, be it a housing or tech bubble. The idea remains the same. Such common sense one would think the Irish establishment remain vigilant of, but their actions remain contrary. Domestic industry, by and large, for small to medium businesses, remain the least supported. Such areas as tourism and the restaurant sectors regularly suffer and decline. The COVID era created severe damage to the hospitality and tourist sectors, many of which did not recover from. The current asylum situation, that has been ongoing since 2021, has put these sectors in the crosshairs once again, with a number of hotel and accommodation owners making arguably bad ethical choices, taking government grants to house Middle Eastern and African men, posing as asylum seekers when really economic migrants, as is happening across Europe, America, and the UK. Arguably coincidence, arguably a manufactured crisis, will be returned to later for further examination. Homegrown employers, though relatively strong in terms of economy size, are still dwarfed by many much larger foreign companies, being the largest employers in finance, technology, and manufacturing in the country. This underutilization of domestic industry and overcompensation and reliance on foreign direct investment has resulted in Ireland having an overly inflated GDP. An overly inflated GDP is a clear sign of a tax haven country, due to the enormous amounts of capital flowing into or through the country, doing little to stimulate real economy, apart from the financial sector, such as banking, investing, taxes, accountancy, and so on, with the sector dwarfing all other areas of real economy. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008 and Celtic Tiger collapse, the Irish government, rather than shift to a more democratic form of economic planning, leaned heavier into tax evasion as a means to recover the economy. In 2009, the then Fianna Fáil government posted to austerity budgets, but quietly convened a commission on taxation made up of banking and consultant circles to try find ways to bring capital back into the crashed economy. They gave the government two ideas. First was to issue capital allowance for intangible assets, which since has placed Ireland as the foremost tax haven for intellectual property in the world. Secondly, to adjust the crown jewel of the Section 110 special purpose vehicle to allow foreign capital as a way to power a recovery in the domestic property sector. Collectively, these have made Ireland into one of the biggest tax havens on the planet. Studies to date confirm that Ireland is officially one of the biggest tax havens in the world. So much so that what could only be described as illicit money flowing into the state has in recent years been staggeringly more so than all of the Caribbean tax havens combined. The evidence confirming this from studies was the clear discrepancies in the amount of profits being booked by domestic companies versus foreign companies. Foreign profits dwarfed that of domestic, giving a clear indication of profit shifting from other jurisdictions not possible without tax haven activity. Later again in 2017, further studies confirmed Ireland still to be a major tax haven, being in the top 5 of the world, through a money-moving process known as sinks and conduits. Conduit tax havens are key to the entire evasion and avoidance system, as they link the world's biggest tax havens to the major financial hubs of New York and London. Such studies help greatly in understanding this system, being differentiated by geography, task specialization, and origin of money flow within territories. A deeper dive into this global network further helps understand Ireland's place in all this. The economist Adam Smith famously described the nature of free market capitalism as the invisible hand that moves events. Since his time, much has changed. Today, global capitalism is dominated by small numbers of major corporations and financial powers who monopolize markets. A study done by the Swiss Institute of Technology in 2011 revealed at the time how 1,318 corporations controlled 80% of global revenues, while 147 corporations controlled 40% of the entire network, with common practices of blocking competition from using their networks, merging to increase market share, as well as buying out or taking over rivals before coming too much of a threat, being common practice. To gain further advantage, they make full use of the legal corporation system by fragmenting themselves into hundreds of different legal entities, each with their own corporation and organized structure. This is done for two reasons. Firstly, to create aspects of competition between entities within the group, allowing the parent company to benefit while controlling all players within the market. Secondly, to help keep costs low and increase profitability. Having multiple different entities means parent companies can engage in what is called transfer pricing and treasury management functions. These basically reduce costs and taxes being carried out by the multiple entities within a parent group, creating value chain links, so as to manipulate internal prices, and so reduce business costs. Finally, in having control of various internal entities, a number of accountability tricks can be used to drive a parent company's overall tax liability towards zero. An example of which is applying for tax deductions for interest payments in a subsidiary country for money that is actually borrowed from another subsidiary country within its group. Another example is to avoid the withholding of taxes or royalties or intellectual property by funneling payments through friendly jurisdictions, offering generous exemptions. The global tax evasion and avoidance system is separated into a number of havens and districts, each having their own special function. There was estimated at the time of the Swiss Institute of Technology 2011 study to be 5 to 6 important conduits in the world, Ireland being third on the list of those 6. There was also an estimated 60 to 100 sink havens. The system works as follows. Firstly, there are financial districts which control and integrate world financial markets, house major investment banks, and provide legal and political framework for the biggest owners of global capital. Next are the conduit havens. These link up the system via low to zero taxes on capital movement, make use of bilateral tax treaties, and highly complex legal systems tailored to global corporations. Finally are the sink havens, which allow untaxed profits to end up in their territory via low-level democratic oversight, high levels of domestic secrecy, and extremely low to zero corporation tax rates. Collectively, these arrangements allow the ethos of tax evasion to thrive by withholding their profits, while manipulating internal policies or democratic states. On the surface, this tax haven system of activity appears as an injustice to democratic and republican government, when the sad fact is, this system is wholly embraced and supported by various governments across the world, Ireland of course being one. The elites of politics, business and finance believe this system to be crucial to the longevity and prosperity of global capitalism, while trying their best to keep it being common knowledge among the tax-paying masses. The political elites of the West being indiscreetly and quietly in support of tax havens puts them further in the spotlight and crosshairs of democratic and public scrutiny, often running on slogans and campaigns of equality and fairness as election promises. To have the rich pay their fair share, to have corporations be taxed fairly and accordingly. When in the halls and backrooms of power, government are in full support and adherence to corporations being given leeway and advantages to skip billions in taxes annually, none more so than in tax haven Ireland. Each country to offer a tax haven have what is known as sectorial specialization. Switzerland, for example, has a long and famous reputation of personal wealth management and privacy. The Netherlands specializes in corporate treasury management. In Ireland's case, there seems to be a specialization in treasury management, insurance and reinsurance companies, and services for holding companies. How this is performed is through what's known as an opt-in, opt-out model. Companies begin by declaring Ireland as their place of business, signing a number of double taxation treaties. This automatically helps them use the state's legal framework to reduce taxation close to zero, by shifting dividends, interest and royalty payments back out of the country, with no withholding tax imposed. US companies comprise the majority of those who use Ireland's tax haven status. In 1996, the IRS changed the rules of taxation of foreign profits for American corporations. From that time on, foreign profits would not be taxed by the IRS. The Irish government, through the Tax Consolidation Act of 1997, allowed US companies to take advantage of this by reforming the domestic tax code, a deliberate ploy to make Ireland more attractive for them. By creating a set of intentionally ambiguous rules in establishing a company in the state, and further access to the Section 110 special purpose vehicle to avoid taxes, companies have flocked to Ireland ever since. The Irish Corporation Tax Code gives companies multiple ways to manage tax. Among the options include, if they wish to pay taxes in Ireland, be incorporated in Ireland but not pay taxes. In the case of American companies, to inform the IRS they are registered in Ireland, while also informing the Irish authorities they are operating overseas. A third option being if they wish to incorporate in a foreign country and still pay Irish taxes by means of a tax treaty between the two countries. Tax treaties define a company's legal standing and to where taxes should be paid, what legal protections are in place, and how disputes are managed. For corporations, essentially they ensure no double taxation. The tax haven industry is so important to the Irish government, it has so far negotiated more than 70 bilateral tax treaties. The second stage, known as the profit sheltering stage. The tax office applies a series of deductions to move a company's profits from gross trading to total taxable income, thus estimating total amount declared annually and how much profit is subject to tax. Companies get to move billions in profit through the system, paying as little as €1 on every 3, reducing taxes on declared profits to between 3 and 4% per annum. This is done through two methods, known as transfer pricing and loan manipulation. Recalling how a parent company can have multiple smaller corporations within its group, transfer pricing, known as TP, works basically by manipulating internal prices so that most profits of any number of those smaller corporations are what is called booked in a low-tax country. This is possible due to how large an area the parent company covers in global trade and market share. The parent further avoids paying tax by having its smaller corporations sell commodities to each other, essentially mirroring what an external company would pay. This fools tax authorities, as it is often done using intellectual property, such as trademarks, logos, and other visual assets. These are a continuous grey area in the world of taxation rules and regulations. How companies profit from this transfer pricing is by basically undervaluing internal commodities going to low-tax countries and overvaluing them in higher tax counterparts, thus profiting off of the difference and being extremely lucrative. Under direction of the EU, the Irish government adopted a TP regime as late as 2010, which, while supposedly monitors and polices this activity, appears to do so poorly, as billions involving TP activity are flushed through the country annually. The tax office has its limits, as its main job is to protect resources in the domestic Irish market, but completely ineffective when dealing with global companies moving higher than normal profits into the state. The government have intentionally designed this mechanism to be essentially one way, on the surface appearing to comply with EU standards and OECD anti-avoidance regulations, while still allowing billions to be funneled annually. In the case of loan manipulation, operates as follows. Multinational conglomerates bypass the need of banks to acquire operating capital, using their own legal and organizational structures to loan from one arm of the parent company to another, regardless of geographic territory. Through the means of international corporate tax laws, this provides interest deduction opportunities, which in a roundabout way pays back the parent company. Different tax havens offer different types of allowances, Ireland being among the most generous, with big tax allowances for any amount of interest a company may pay. To make gains on this, multinationals only have to find another tax haven where interest is not taxed. The only available means of policing this at present is to limit the amount of debt used to finance a company's operations. Most countries have a thin set of capitalization rules, but as of 2020, Ireland hasn't implemented any deemed effective enough by the EU Commission, despite being signed up to the EU's anti-tax avoidance directive. In fact, This directive in Ireland was meant to be signed into law in 2019, with the present Irish government seeking a special plea from the EU to put it off until 2024, as they know full well the implementation of this would spell disaster for multinationals due to the introduction of fixed interest limitations, effectively closing tax-dodging loopholes. This neglect of existing legal and monetary laws and channels since the 1990s has helped funnel vast profits through the Irish state. Billions in profits have passed through. All the while successive governments continue their corruptions and incompetences in managing the country. Ordinary workers being subjected to higher and higher taxes, increased cost of living, a poorly functioning public health service and a burgeoning welfare system, as well as chronic housing shortages, all the while serving the needs and whims of the elites. That still continues. The final stage of the tax avoidance funneling through the Irish state is known as the profits out stage. This concerns withholding taxes and that of dividends, interest on royalties and capital gains that are traditionally levied at a higher rate than trading profits. In the case of multinational corporations and other elite individuals, they are given the privilege of not being subject to dirt tax, but ordinary retail investors and savers are. Dirt tax, which stands for Deposit Interest Retention Tax, taxes gains made from dividends and savings. The government has established a holding company regime based on deliberate and poorly controlled foreign company rules. These holding companies are the backbone to the global conglomerate setup. Their job is to separate ownership from management in a way that allows legal separation from day-to-day operations, giving to tax advantages. The first being the placing of intellectual property, also known as IPs, in them, in countries with low corporation taxes, claiming profits from sales can be moved out of countries with higher tax to lesser ones, such as Ireland. Secondly, withholding companies can be used to defer any taxes that might occur on profits, by shifting resulting royalties and dividends into controlled companies outside their own jurisdiction. Rules around withholding companies are meant to stop this practice from happening. In the case of Ireland, the government resisted for as long as they could until the EU made impositions, establishing a regime in 2019, while still allowing tax avoidance on company passive income. But because the Irish tax system makes exemptions so generous on this income, makes it a pointless and futile exercise. In summary, Ireland has remained a tax haven for over 20 years for the following reasons. Having EU membership, offering capital gains tax exemptions, a generous foreign tax credit system, an expansive double tax treaty network, lack of control of foreign company rules, as well as thin capitalization rules, and the ability to pay dividends, free of withholding tax. Ireland, for the time being, remains one of the biggest tax havens in the world. But who are the people operating within the IFSC behind the curtain and pulling the strings? There is what could be described a fixer network of corporate legal and accounting firms making a very lucrative living, facilitating and maintaining the machinery of tax haven Ireland, and not surprisingly, working in tandem with the country's political elite and revenue commissioners, ensuring Ireland's laws are being updated continuously to stay ahead of the EU's taxation rules, as well as those of other countries, namely the IRS, to facilitate their tax-avoiding residents. Among the largest players facilitating tax haven Ireland, while working in collusion with the establishment, are the law firm Matheson. Among its top priorities is to be a lobbyist for its tax-avoiding resident clients within the state, communicating regularly with the Revenue Commissioner and relative government departments to stay ahead of tax laws and keep taxes low through various schemes. One such scheme is the Irish Collective Asset Management Vehicle, giving clients means of no withholding tax, while also allowing US clients escape taxes in the US. This vehicle is also used by other major hedge fund firms operating in the IFSC. The Central Bank of Ireland acts as the incorporating, authorising and supervisory body for the vehicle. Key law firms are also at the heart of Ireland's tax-avoiding network, understanding the clauses that give companies the appearance of tax compliance and neutrality. Matheson lobby the Irish government in deciding schemes to tax dodge routinely through the use of charitable trusts that allow funds pay a minimum on taxes. One such example being vulture funds and property assets after the GFC, as charitable trusts can be used to hold assets tax-free. In Ireland's case, among the worst examples of such loophole exploitation was the buying up of household mortgages by US vulture fund Mars Capital, who bought household mortgages from the now defunct Anglo-Irish Bank with a massive discount, who then squeezed Irish mortgage holders for the full value of their loan, making millions in profits while only paying hundreds in corporate tax through using a charitable trust. So why are charity trusts the perfect tax-dodging vehicle? They appear philanthropic and give companies a good public image. They cannot be declared bankrupt and give residency location, keeping tax authorities outside of country of residency at bay. And last but not least, provide a thin veil of secrecy for the real owners to hide behind. Matheson used charity trusts to hide all kind of global securities and hedge funds for clients. Firms such as Matheson were key to the Celtic Tiger's rise, having used the same techniques that once built up the country's financial sector, would later deny and squeeze much-needed revenue from tax-dodging hedge fund residents in its fall to aid the country's recovery, confirming suspicions that multinationals have loyalty to themselves first and foremost. What is further truly bizarre to comprehend to the uninformed is how the Irish State and Tax Office aid these firms when justifiably should be punishing them only confirms further suspicions that they care more for globalism than nationalism and are hand in glove with its tax-avoiding residents, and indeed since the foundations of the IFSC always have been at the forsaking of the Irish people. Such further examples of this morally depraved relationship include the state servicing the needs of these firms in using special purpose vehicles to help clients avoid tax and attain tax neutrality. The use of special purpose vehicles offers little to nothing in GDP, have no employees and only generating fees for the legal and financial sector, making little to no economic sense for the government to be in support of such operations, losing out on taxes in the millions annually. What further adds insult to injury is the government regularly pay consultancy fees to these legal and financial firms by commercial semi-state bodies. These legal and accountancy firms have regular consultancy contracts, making fees numbering in the millions, who suspiciously are exempt from Freedom of Information Act inquiry. Perhaps the biggest insult to injury to date concerning this toxic state and financial sector relationship has been the selling of assets through NOMA back to companies who had a hand in the bursting of the Celtic Tiger bubble. This is done through the use of special purpose vehicles so as to pay little tax as possible back to the state, and thus back to the tax-paying public, having suffered immensely since the housing and financial crash of 2008. The four biggest global accountancy firms earning billions for their services in the area of tax avoidance especially, being Deloitte, KPMG, Ernst & Young, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, are also the four largest present at the IFSC. They are as important an agent of tax avoidance as are the culpable law firms. Just as the state are hand in glove with law firms, so too with accountancy firms through consultancy, all of which collude to find tax loopholes and ways to push tax burdens away from multinationals and onto the ordinary taxpayer. It has been blurred deliberately, where state policy ends and legal and accountancy firm lobbying begins. Accountancy firm involvement with the Irish state occurs in a number of ways, mainly via consultancy services and fees, in producing reports and giving advice supposedly independent and impartial for proposals and actions. This provides the perfect front of being outside and impartial, while being a convenient scapegoat for government players to win the public over to political agendas. Being involved with taxation policy also places them in a perfect position to be no longer outside help or lobbyists, but inside policy makers, benefiting clients at the sake of the public good, allowing them to be given access to state resources, figureheads, and essentially remain watchdogs for their multinational clients, while government keep them at arm's length for their expertise. To recap and summarize on the significance of the IFSC. Having been established in 1987, it has been the base of operations for Irish and other international elites to house tax-dodging operations on an international scale. It functions as one of the world's major offshore systems of shadow banking. It has a fixer network of accountancy and legal firms, whose daily business is to arrange and facilitate the complex structures of tax avoidance for transnational corporations. The main means of operation are tax treaties, special purpose vehicles, and UCITS to facilitate money movement and tax avoidance. Essentially, the success and growth of the IFSC has been the ability to offer investors a number of key advantages as a conduit between US and European financial markets, being geographical location and artificially declared profits via discrete deals with Irish revenue, as well as light touch regulation and low corporate tax rate. One other major asset management firm, indeed one of the world's largest, that consider the IFSC to be of key importance to their operations, are BlackRock. In the Celtic Tiger fallout of 2008, BlackRock were among the major firms to swoop on Ireland in the establishment of NOMA, buying up vast amounts of properties and mortgages. To this day, they remain among the largest private portfolio holders of residential property in the country, pulling in millions annually from rental income, having billions in assets under management at the IFSC also. However, the BlackRock association with Ireland goes much farther. In 2011, the government awarded them, against EU public tender laws, a contract by the Irish Central Bank to stress test the private banks of the time. This was purely to their favour, as the government have since issued legislation for firms to write off past losses so as to reduce taxable income, and given BlackRock own shares in Bank of Ireland, was a win-win for profits well into the future. What attract major asset management firms such as BlackRock to the IFSC is little to no restriction on high-risk speculative investment hedge funds. This lack of normal regulations has the IFSC housing an estimated 40% of global hedge funds. The Section 110 tax avoidance regime, stemming from the Tax Consolidation Act of 1997 and use of special purpose vehicles, all work in tandem to facilitate one further financial vehicle, known as an FVC, which stands for Financial Vehicle Corporation. This basically is the packaging of longer-term income streams, such as mortgages and business loans, into assets to be sold, similar to the collateralized debt obligation and mortgage-backed securities of the subprime mortgage crisis between 2007 and 2010. From the IFSC, hedge funds can be authorized and active within a 24-hour period. Since 2008, hedge fund profits have exploded from €219 billion to €732 billion as of 2021. The government and Irish revenue in the course of time have become even more responsive and compliant to tax-avoiding resident demands of anonymity. The invention of the Irish Collective Asset Management Vehicle was the solution, giving complete hedge fund speculation, anonymity and tax-exempt status, with only the requirement of a form filed with the central bank, while all activity is kept out of Irish revenue's registration and public reporting. The Irish government maintain an unhealthy lobbying relationship with the likes of BlackRock. As explored previously, BlackRock, as well as other firms, position themselves to try manipulate legislation in their favor, getting close to political and economic resources on a local and EU level. The government, indeed due to this lobbying and revolving door culture, sees ministers operating from positions within halls of power, coming from major financial and legal firms and vice versa. This dangerously undemocratic lobbying culture was exposed not long after the Celtic Tiger crash, in what was called the Clearinghouse Group. This was essentially an abuse of government office during the noughties, when in a bizarre and unconventional move, the Department of the Taoiseach employed the Department of Finance and Revenue Commissioners to act as consultants. This was later disbanded and exposed as a clear and obvious infiltration and integration attempt of these government offices by major firms such as Merrill Lynch, Citibank, KPMG and others, drafting and tweaking government policy to suit their agendas. In 2012, then Irish MEP Nessa Childers exposed tax break perks being made for Clearinghouse Group executives, comprising of members of these firms, in the annual budget of the Treocher austerity measures for Ireland, while the ordinary public were facing major recession and hardship. The Clearinghouse Group being exposed quickly called for its abolishment. Since, however, new committees behind closed doors have formed, consisting of the same legal and financial firms, in the guise of advising top civil servants, various government departments, and the Industrial Development Authority. Various bodies, such as Transparency International, have criticized this blatant hypocrisy of the establishment and its leaders, facilitating and protecting the private interests of corporate elites, all the while supposedly acting as publicly elected servants, working for the Irish public's welfare and interests. Response to these criticisms come in the form of lip service statements, such as "we need foreign investment," "low taxes are crucial to foreign direct investment firms," and "we must remain competitive." The entire tax avoidance IFSC operation has left the Irish state wide open to vast sums of potentially illicit funds being funneled through the IFSC and back to home countries, namely the US. In response to increasing scrutiny from bodies such as Transparency International, as well as governmental pressures from the EU itself, the Irish establishment continue to drag its heels on creating a transparent company register concerning the IFSC's tax avoidance ongoings. Again, wholly hypocritical and truly undemocratic. In decades past, as now, US investment into Ireland has concentrated mainly on technology, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment. A major shift, however, began to happen as of the late 2010s. US firms, still only comprising a small percentage of national employment, began to show an increase in revenues, disproportionate to their outputs in the country and relative to GDP. Facilitated by the IFSC, a rapid growth in US firms now set their sights on the transfer of intangible assets via the means of intellectual property through tax haven Ireland, as a way to funnel profits, as explored previously, rather than invest more industrially and thus provide more jobs for the country. Thanks to the IFSC's tax avoidance system, corporations have the means to create holding companies, contract subsidiaries in low-paid countries such as Asia to manufacture products, before using an Irish office to what is called book sales. The Irish office can also charge administration expenses for tax purposes to a foreign subsidiary for arranging these sales. Either way, profits will appear to be made in Ireland and not abroad, and so charged minimum taxes. Hundreds of companies making use of the IFSC's tax avoidance system are doing this in all manner of industry, both Irish and foreign. The European Union, since 2017, has continued to pressure the Irish government to implement an accounting directive for companies for the issuing of public accounts, having had until 2022 to do so. Although the presence and type of US tech companies who continue to flock to Ireland have moved with the times, the emphasis on the tax-avoiding intellectual property route remains the same, where once hard tech companies such as Apple, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, and Microsoft set up manufacturing operations, only to move to regions such as Asia for cheap labor. Social media and cloud computing companies such as Facebook, Amazon, and Google have now established themselves, partially to offer employment, but mainly, of course, for the tax benefits. Far from avoiding or bypassing state interaction, social media companies, largely Facebook, have become cozy with government, just as much as legal and financial firms, actively promoting each other's interests. As typical of the Irish government in its relationship to US companies, it maintains a light touch to regulation, while having an open-door policy for lobbyists. The issue of data protection has become central to this relationship, with levels of which apparently being low within the state. The Department of Data Protection have blatantly turned a blind eye to data harvesting by Facebook and others without the knowledge or consent of users, with no department or state apparatus existing to make or file complaints within the state. Here we end examination of tax haven Ireland. Last but not least, with the area of housing, vulture funds, and NOMA. As previously examined, the Irish government between the 1930s and 1950s made housing a national priority. This all changed with the rise of Jack Lynch and Charles Haughey's Fianna Fáil policies, viewing housing as an asset and not a home. This continued to worsen with the flooding of foreign capital into the country in years to follow, having reached a crisis point with the collapse of the Celtic Tiger. The housing situation of the country continues to be in the grips of vulture funds, with Fianna Fáil and other parties remaining impotent and compliant. Through this privately managed housing model for the benefit of vulture funds, the neglect of social housing programs has come about as a disastrous consequence. No government program to regulate social housing for the good of the native Irish population, ahead of foreign nationals, exists, effectively being a free-for-all. Foreign nationals can apply for social housing as well as buy property, something a number of other countries strictly regulate, to natives being first in the queue. Evidence proves also that foreign nationals are being given priority over Irish natives and citizens. having only been in the country for a matter of just a few years to a few months, being given accommodation ahead of Irish natives having been on housing lists for many years. Why is the state so heavily invested and subservient to the vulture funds and property developers, spending millions annually leasing property from them, when it could just as easily build, as has happened in the past? What is even more perplexing is this decision to rent from the private sector while withholding state land, only benefiting developers by driving up house prices. The only answer being, this is done deliberately, driven by greed. This toxic political property-developer relationship is being intentionally facilitated at the sake of the Irish people, as historically demonstrated through the Main Tribunal and other documented events. One such argument that exists in defense of this is how state support and adherence to the nature of property development in Ireland is a necessary evil, as native capital isn't strong enough to run the property sector without tax breaks and advantages, as tax policies can either stagnate or stimulate property development. The nature of property development and political collusion in modern-day Ireland has its roots in the 1980s, where government of the time began to give tax incentives to the building sector, such as site purchasing costs and loans. In 1986, an urban renewal scheme was launched overstepping existing planning laws of the time, giving tax breaks for commercial ventures such as office blocks and hotels, while creating a stimulus in jobs. It wasn't long before corruption reared its head, where the planning tribunal of the time investigated links between decisions on urban renewal and money flowing to Fianna Fáil, as the party were in financial straits, offering development rights in return for donations and fundraising activity. Come the 1990s, the economy saw a boom, while taxes should have risen with it, only for Fianna Fáil to cut capital gains tax to keep developers on their side. Investors flocked to the property sector for no other reason than tax benefits. They soon caught the attention of the Department of Finance, questioning this logic of tax cuts during an economic boom, risking destabilizing the wider economy due to asset price inflation. Tax avoidance in the property sector, no thanks to a largely responsible Fianna Fáil government, continued well into the noughties and the Celtic Tiger era. Their tax relief scheme saved developers €8.4 billion in 2004 alone. As the boom grew and grew, Fianna Fáil continued to cut taxes, while building costs and average industrial earnings quadrupled. Being blinded by their arrogance, this eventually would become dangerously unsustainable. The Celtic Tiger property craze became so out of hand that by 2012, half of all wealth in the country was tied up in property, before the eventual and inevitable crash. The Irish state bailed out the moneymen responsible for the property crash. Through a blanket insurance covering bondholders who speculated and lost and rightly deserved to suffer and take their losses, was a blatant demonstration of the facade of government power and the power of international finance that control and move nations.
Investing, you look at the world and you make an investment. Okay, so that's what it is. Right now we have a world, the U.S. looks pretty good. Okay, and when you have different times, you have to pay attention to money. Okay, money does move markets. Money has moved the credit markets an incredible amount. An incredible amount. Let me tell you a story. You want to hear a great credit story?
Of course I do.
I got a great credit. So we invested in the Bank of Ireland. Okay, the Bank of Ireland. And we bought their bonds, subordinated bonds. And the Bank of Ireland said they were having equity guys invest in the Bank of Ireland, and they wanted to cram us down. okay? And we said, no, you can't cram us down because we'll buy the equity. So we took them
What,
to
they
court.
thought you were just a debt guy?
They thought, well, we go to, we'll play the game. So we went and, we were going to go in English and Irish courts to fight the Bank of Ireland and fight the Irish government for that matter. So, we owned this debt and we fought them, we won. The debt was trading at 40, 50 cents, and we finally won at the beginning of this year, okay? So the debt was trading 40, 50 cents even last year, 50, 60, something like that. So the Bank of Ireland this year goes and issues a new issue of the same debt, same coupon debt, maybe 2 years shorter, okay? So they issued this debt at par, I don't know, it was a month and a half ago, okay? Same coupon, same thing. The debt now is trading at 115. Okay, this is a company. This is a company and a government that want to cram us down, and they came in here and we bought it. Now the only reason it's worth buying is because we fought it and we won.
Much has since been written and documented on the aftermath, the results of which the country continue to live with, and much of the reason why Ireland is the country it is today. The bailouts that took place in December of 2010 marked the moment Ireland and its people lost economic sovereignty to EU and global financial powers beyond their control. 67.5 billion euros was borrowed from the European Central Bank, European Commission and International Monetary Fund, while 17.5 billion euros was raided from the State Pension Fund, totaling a bailout of 85 billion euros. 35 of which was used to bail out the country's banks. The purpose of NOMA, or so the public were told, was to stabilise and revive Ireland's property sector. What it did achieve, however, was burdening the taxpayer by moving 78 billion euros in non-performing loans onto their shoulders, while benefiting the property developers and vulture funds to pick up the spoils. Self-preservation by the political and business elites of Ireland's Golden Circle, as well as those related internationally, were squarely behind the bank bailout decision, using the tax-paying masses as both their scapegoat and safety net. Without state intervention, billions worth of property would have been dumped onto the markets, thus depressing prices and spelling financial ruin for among many key Fianna Fáil supporters and donors. To date, NOMA has taken on the debts of loans from borrowers with at least a 5 million euros value, with reported cases of 180 owing more than 100 million euros. Through its creation, NOMA has indeed stabilised the property sector, but also benefit banks, hedge and vulture funds, as well as of course developers and political circles at hand. The skilled workmen who built the properties ending up in financial straits of their own, many of course emigrating in the wake of the crash. The fixation on real estate to give satisfactory returns for investors is a global phenomenon, but is at risk of its user value being separated from its market value. As market value goes up, it shatters the link between the price of a home and average wage. The establishing of NOMA may on the surface appear to have been an emergency response to a once-in-a-generation crisis, but the government had other agendas in mind. Given the tax haven model in place could offer real estate speculators around the world a unique proposition of bargain basement assets and a domestic tax haven to shelter them from taxes in. Private equity funds such as BlackRock and Lone Star flooded into the country, and the rest was history. NOMA remains in operation, the toxic loans and property deals on its books still being dealt with. The government continue to service the private property sector and minimise social housing. The bank bailouts of 2010 will continue to be paid off by generations of taxpayers to come. All the while, Ireland's national debt climbs to 235 billion as of 2024.